Good afternoon. I'm Julie Cumming, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself, and then I'll pass it on to my colleague, Linda Pearse. So I started off as a recorder player, was very involved in the early music scene in Boston and in New York. I got a doctorate in musicology at UC Berkeley. I taught at Wellesley College, where I directed the Collegium, and then I moved to McGill. And at McGill, I started working very closely with Peter Schubert, who at that time was really exploring the role of improvisation in Renaissance counterpoint, and with our student, Catherine Motus. And I started to learn to improvise myself. And having learned to improvise, I also thought this is something everybody should know. So I started teaching it to my students. Improvisation was a central part of Renaissance musical culture and pedagogy. It was in church with liturgical improvisation over a chant, cantare super librum. It was in the chamber, both amateurs and professionals would improvise. In the ballroom, wind bands were playing. In the marketplace, cantastorie were accompanying themselves with improvised bowed string instruments. We've always known that improvisation existed in the Renaissance. But musicologists like me thought it was a lost practice, impossible to recover because it was an oral tradition. Until people like Ross Duffin, Peter Schubert, Philippe Conquiem, Adam Gilbert, Rob Wegman, and Barnabé Janin realized that all counterpoint treatises of the Renaissance are actually about ensemble improvisation. So we know that counterpoint means improvisation because of the threefold division of music study found in both treatises and archival documents. Cantus planus is plain chant. Contrapunctus is improvised counterpoint usually against a chant melody. And cantus figuratus is notated polyphony. So we can see this in Gregorius's treatise, Practica Musicae. This was the fundamental feature of practical music. And we see in the title page here that we have a whole choir of men and boys looking up at a big lectern where we see what looks like might be a big choir book of notated polyphony. But if we look a little bit more closely at that lectern, we see that it's black notes with the tune Benedicamus Domino, a chant, a standard chant, Cantus Firmus. And so what we see in this picture, even in Gregorius's treatise, is the process of learning to improvise against a chant. So learning about improvisation is one thing, and learning to improvise is another. And we've been learning about improvisation for a long time. Ferrand wrote this book in 1938. Sachs wrote a very important book. But what they described seemed like magic, not something that we could actually reconstruct or achieve ourselves. But once you start learning to improvise, it demystifies many aspects of Renaissance music. It explains how all kinds of musicians were trained, how they created new music without notation, and how they composed their music in separate parts rather than scores. When you focus on the craft of improvisation, it moves away from the genius of the great composer and goes into an everyday practice that all kinds of people participated in, including women and people who were not highly educated, maybe couldn't even read. And this is described by Wegman and Fiorentino. So in the classes that I taught, we had a whole series of topics. And we started out by using the Guidonian hand because that's how they learned in the Renaissance. And then we worked from easier to harder techniques of improvisation, parallel thirds and sixths, cadences, faux bourdon, falso bordone, improvisable canon known as stratofuga, chant paraphrase canon, 3 and 4 voice stratofuga, canon over a cantus firmus, parallel 10th model, contrapunto del grado, which is a very basic technique of note against note improvisation, but it's actually quite hard. So I put that near the end. And finally, contrapunto fugato, which is about a repeated motive over a cantus firmus. And these were the topics for each week of my seminars. So my basic approach for every class was that students read an excerpt of a treatise on one technique of improvisation. They read an article on the topic. They learn the improvisation technique in class, then go away, practice with their fellow students, and improvise with classmates in the next class. And we study a piece or more than one piece and discuss the use of improvisatory techniques in that piece. So now I'm handing it off to Linda.
Hi, I'm Linda Pearse, and I'll tell you a little bit about myself to get started. My early training was both in sort of written music as a young pianist and also in improvised music as a Dixieland trombonist. My training in a Bachelor of Music degree in jazz at McGill led to a sackbut degree at the Schola Cantorum Basiliensis in Switzerland. Following a career as a freelancer in Europe, I moved to Bloomington, Indiana, and completed my Doctor of Music in trombone with minors in music history and theory. I taught sackbut at the Historical Performance Institute in Indiana, and I also directed an early music ensemble, Sakabuche, since about 2007. And now I'm an associate professor at Mount Allison in Canada, and I'm also a PhD student in musicology, studying with Julie at McGill. I took Julie's historical pedagogy seminar in 2019. So until 2019, my education in performance and music history unfolded on largely separate tracks. Performance instruction engaged primarily with performance style and techniques, informed in part by treatises. Musicology seminars focused on the study of written music and traditions, but did not involve experiential learning through performance. And despite this, very high quality of instruction, for which I'm really thankful, I was unable to connect these two modes of learning and understanding in meaningful ways. Julie's seminar bridged these two modes of studies. First, by combining the historical study of Renaissance pedagogical techniques with the experiential learning in and outside of class with my fellow students. In addition, a study of primary and secondary literature further elaborated this missing middle ground. So my experiences from that seminar begin with the Guidonian hand. And I've studied the Guidonian hand many times and in many different situations, but I never practiced it over time. So in her class, we learned how to sing with the Guidonian hand. The process began with sight, so reading the pitches on the staff. And then we would pre-hear the next pitch based on written notes. Then we would sing that note, and then we'd learn how to move our fingers to the right spot on the hand. But after a lot of practice, I noticed that the order changed. So sight moved directly to touch. I'd see the note, I'd touch the spot on my finger, and the correct pitch would emerge, and I wouldn't have to have that step in the middle. With sustained practice, I just no longer had to think too much about the next pitch in my mind. With improvisation, we learned a lot about stretta fuga in class, and I improvised in and outside of class with my colleagues, Sylvain Margot and Karine Cuellar-Rendon. And then I incorporated stretta fuga improvisation into an undergraduate course at Mount Allison University that I was teaching, and had my students doing weekly practice in and outside of class. I wrote a seminar paper on Ortiz's recercadas in 1553, considering them as models for improvisation over repeated bass patterns. So drawing on skills from my jazz training and those of Renaissance improvisation, the paper identifies repeated patterns, melodic ideas, and structural devices in the recercadas. And then using that information, I taught myself to improvise using my analysis of Ortiz's approach as a model. And that led to McGill's Research Alive series, which invites selected researchers to give presentations that combine research and performance for a general non-specialist audience. In February 2020, with the pandemic really emerging, Karen and I gave a live stream presentation that taught a general audience how to improvise. These experiences, all taken together, show that it is possible for non-specialist audiences and students of all ages, and I include myself with that, to learn how to do simple Renaissance improvisation within a short period of time.
Canguilhem, in his article, Seeing Upon the Book, according to Vicente Lusitano, describes this test for prospective choir masters at the Cathedral of Toledo in the early 17th century. And he says, was it truly possible to improvise a line on a plain chant melody, or even more inconceivable on a mensural melody, while at the same time using the Guidonian hand to show one, or at times two, singers which notes to sing, thus adding a third and fourth voice? And now we can say, having actually learned the Guidonian hand and learned to improvise, we can say, yes, it was possible. The hand becomes a physical and tactile referent analogous to a keyboard, and models such as falso bordone are fairly simple to improvise against a chant. So we can do it. You can learn to do it too. Thank you.
Thank you.